Welcome to Getting Ghosted, an intuitive, soul collective podcast. I'm your host, Allie Horner. Welcome back, everybody. I have some good news. We have some fun topics coming up in this next month. And number one, Anna has been popping back in. It's been a little bit since I have heard from her, but she's popping back in. I actually was out on my walk this morning and lo and behold, there she was. And she had a lot of questions for me. So I'm going to bring her back in now and see if she wants to chime in and just I've noticed it's, really, she kind of guides the discussion as well. Like she has things that she wants to share, she wants to talk about as well. And this morning I had questions about our history. I was trying to look at questions that people had asked her from the comment sections on TikTok, from questions that people had sent in. And I noticed there were certain things she wasn't really answering as much, mostly because she didn't have the knowledge of those things yet. Almost like she was like, oh, I'd have to go look that up in our archives. I'd have to do this. I'd have to do that. So just kind of keep that in mind. She's not like a spirit guide. She's not all knowing. Just like, we can study history from, 200 years ago. We're not going to have every little thing memorized, right? And it's likely there's a lot that we have not that wouldn't have made it into our history books. A lot of detail, a lot of pieces. And as you know, in the US and in many areas, history and the history that was disclosed to us has not always been accurately disclosed to us. They tend to shift or leave out a lot. And that is something a lot of us have just been finding out, right? And so there's like a big movement of people who are starting to find this out. And so it's so you have to really think about it from that perspective as well. That there, for us, just like we have to learn about history and we have to kind of almost select how, what pieces am I going to learn about? Who am I going to learn about? How much detail am I going to go into about all these different time periods and all these different parts of the world, et cetera. It's the same thing for them. It's not like they're learning about every little piece of US history and every single thing. So you have to remember that, because a lot of people are asking about outcomes for the US and stuff like that. And Anna's kind of like there are certain things that we may think they're super significant right now because we're in them. But 200 years in the future, they're not maybe looked at as so significant because those people aren't living in it. Like maybe certain things didn't quite make it into the history books, right? And so a lot of people, I know it takes a lot to zoom out like that. Everyone, I really know, I know it does, to not hyperfixate on the here and now. But you have to kind of understand when it comes to, just like if someone from 200, 300 years in the past was asking us about certain events, we might be like, I actually don't know about that. I have to look at that up, because again, a lot of people have been asking what's going to happen with this and this, and it's like she has to go look it up, you know what I mean? She doesn't have immediate knowledge of that because maybe it wasn't something that they were really taught about in school. It ended up not being as significant as maybe some of us think it's going to be. There's a lot of things we fixate on, stress about, worry about, that just don't end up being, they're like little blips in time in the larger scheme of things. I know it's so hard to think about, but that is truly it. So sometimes when we get questions about what's going to happen with certain things, Anna just doesn't know, right? So that's not something she would know. She has said a couple times she'll go back and look in the archives for things. So there's other things though that she's just, not as focused on. It's not her area of expertise. She's not a spirit guide. She's a person, right? So again, it's like there's certain things also that she just isn't going to really know about or have the knowledge about. Okay. So just kind of keep that in mind, keep that perspective when you're listening. Okay. So getting started. So Anna is saying, she said, I want you all to understand what we see as significant from your time frame. And I was like, okay. I didn't expect us to go into that direction, but here she goes, here we are though. And so she's saying, everything in your time frame, it's easy for you to get lost in it, get lost in the details. And she said, one of the things that we do study now out in the future that we learn about, and it's almost been like a lesson. And she said, this is going to sting a little bit. She's doing her fingers a little bit. She said, it's complacency. That is one of the things that we actually have learned a lot about from your time frame. And she's saying like we were taught about it in school, and she said we were also taught about propaganda and media and news cycles. And she said, and it's not just your specific year. Like it's not like 2026 is the main highlight reel of what they study. She said it's more so something that we've been studying because it spans a large part of your history. And she was showing me like a timeline, like her looking at something it looks similar to a computer, but it's not. And she said, we have different study materials and ways because they have different technology, but she was showing me books obviously still exist and stuff. And she was like, so we just have a different perspective because we're able to see things in overarching themes. Like she said, when people study history, they're not just studying facts and events, they're studying movements, they're studying change, they're studying time periods, evolutionary cycles, how things shift and change over time is very fascinating to us. And she said, so what you are going through, there's a larger, she said, she's calling it a propaganda machine. And she said there is a larger propaganda machine that's kind of controlling the way in which you look at media, peruse media. And she's saying in the way in which you think about things and see things. And she said, we also study and learn about how that impacts people in the world and in your part of the world. And she's showing mostly like North America and some European countries. And she said there's a lot of complacency amongst people. And she said almost like people are being spoon-fed. And she's showing it being like cornmeal, like it's like some sort of oatmeal, cornmeal, something where people don't know that there's more. And she said it's almost like you don't realize there's a whole buffet. You just keep getting spoon-fed these little bits of like porridge almost. And you're like, oh, great, more, because you don't realize there's more. And she said that things could be better. And so she said that is something that we are studying about that we have learned about your time period. We had to learn about it in school. And she said because it became so far-fetched, and I was like, well, what do you mean far-fetched? Or can you, I have a guess, but I'm like, can you clarify? And she said, well, really like the mass media and the propaganda you have, it really keeps a lot of people sort of like under the thumb of your sort of like cultural elite. And she said, this is like oligarchy. And she said, I think that's the word. And she said, now technology is really advanced and grown by the time, she said, in our time period. And she said there are things that we have that it's difficult to kind of like, she's trying to display it. Like I'm seeing images of what she looks at. And she's showing me, she said, of course, certain parts of the world don't have certain pieces of technology yet. And then other parts of the world do have it. And she said, like, for example, like we do have these like screens, and she's showing being able to pull up screens that she almost has like something on one finger and something on a thumb. And it's like a magnet looking thing, but it's not quite that. And it pulls up this sort of like screen area. And then she said, there are also many people who abstain from using this and many people who abstain from a lot of technology, and that's fine. She said, we don't see that as any sort of, like there's no suspicion around that. She said it's more integrated. And she said, to reiterate, like what I've said before, we do have AI. It's more integrated. It hasn't taken over. She's kind of laughing at us. She goes, it hasn't taken over. They found more sustainable ways to work with it. And she said, and it's more controlled by the people. It's not controlled, but it's not in the hands of like a fair few. And she said, but it does have very talented architects working on it. Who are ensuring that it's implemented the right way. And she said, because there was so much clashing over it during your timeline, Allie, your time, not timeline, time frame. And she said, now I bring this up because, again, in your time frame, a lot of your technology is in the hands of a fair few, and it's being bought by certain people. And she said, this we've studied in our history books. And she said, I think you can guess at some of who is buying it and who's using it and what they're using it for and how. And she said, now it's not the vast majority of people, but there are some people who have a lot of funds who are using technology to their own advantages and kind of keeping certain things out of the hands of others. And she said, there's a lot of things also in your time frame that you're just not being informed about. And that's because technology can be used against you, like almost like things can be hidden in plain sight. She's showing things being buried in search results, stuff like that. And so she said, this is important to recognize because many of you are not getting facts. You're not getting accurate information. And you're also being, she's saying like warmongered, fearmongered a lot. And she said it creates complacency, like helplessness. And she said, we don't really have as much of that type of thing in the future. And she said, also, though, we have our health more in the future. We have more ability to control our circumstances. We have better preventative health. So our brains and bodies work better. So we're less likely to feel helpless or complacent. She said, and I said, do you have medical debt? And she goes, medical debt? And I was like, yeah, do you have debt from like that's a big thing in the States is people have crippling medical debt. So you could be doing really great. And then all of a sudden, if you get sick, like it's like that's it. And she goes, oh, no, God, no. Like she was like, we don't have any problems with that. And I said, do it. And she said, there are parts of the world where things aren't as widespread yet, like certain technology isn't caught on. But she said, it's much more altruistic. It's not ideal. She said, there's still people who they're wrapped in their heads. They want control or power. She said, of course, that still exists, but it's not quite what it was she goes, when you were alive. And she goes, well, I guess you are alive. And she goes, and I was kind of like laughing about it because I was like, no, I know what you're trying to say. She said, I also want them to know that I looked up this whole situation with power and control and how they're going to handle this. And then she said, my advice would be to keep their eyes in their ears, keep a watchful eye. She said, don't get too caught up in news cycles. Make sure that you are turning off the televisions, that you're not staying on social media too long. She said this is very important because she's showing me like she said brain drain and brain, like she's saying there's almost like cognitive damage. And she said, but the brain is resilient and we know this now. And she said, so you can fight this, like you can fight that and you can begin to implement new technology in other ways. You do not have to get kind of like railroaded by it or let it like impact you. She said, this is hard for you to understand because a lot of you are in a time period in which technology is kind of taking over. It's going faster than humans can kind of fathom or keep up with. And she said, and that's very much by design, because then you feel helpless with it. And she said, but also there are certain technological advances that are coming that are going to be really important. She said, but they've got to work out kinks. She's mostly showing me healthcare. Health tech is what they call it, health tech. And she said like disability care, AI. And I was asking her, I was like, well, is AI and tech like really helpful for, and she said, oh yes. And she said, because of advancements that were made in technology during your time frame, she says, and she said throughout the course of your life and beyond, she's showing me there being a faster capacity to solve problems. And she said, and what ended up happening is we found out that there were a lot of things that needed to be prevented. And we started to pinpoint exactly what was causing certain things. And she said, some people probably already know, but there's even more going on than meets the eye. And she's showing me like frequency. And she's going back to the renewable energy piece that she talked about in the first channeling episode. So if you have questions and you're curious about that, go back and listen to part 1. Because she said, so remember I talked about renewables and the type of energy that you have, that you guys really heavily rely on and everything. And I was like, yes. And she said, remember how I said it impacts your frequency? And I was like, yes. And she said, remember how I said that impacts your psychic gifts? And I was like, yes. And she said, well, it also impacts your brain and bodies. It can make you sick. And she said, this is something we know full well now, but this is something that's kind of hidden from you guys. And I said, well, it is overall, but there are a lot of people who are becoming aware. And she goes, yes. And that's part of what we call, she's saying the awakening, the change. And I was like, oh, so you do know the awakening? She goes, oh, yes. And she said it was a very potent time throughout history. And she said it's more widespread than you know. It's not just in North America. it has to do with more of the world. She said, but there's certain parts of the world that are much more advanced than North America. And there's certain parts of the world in which she said the tech is evolving faster than human consciousness is. And that's kind of the fear for some people. But she said, but you'd be wise not to really try to over control it or fear it too much. It's more about the people whose hands it's in. She said that's more where the control is. And she's saying like it being used the wrong way. She said, like, even an apple in the wrong hands, she's showing someone throwing an apple at someone else, like a bully. And she said, even something as simple as an apple in the wrong hands can be used for harm. And she said, technology and AI is no different. And I was like, that's really good perspective, Anna. Thank you. That's my guides talk about that too. And she said, I want to know more about these guides. That's fascinating. Like she and I have talked about guides before, and I'm like, oh, do you talk to guides? She was like, no. And she said, sometimes she's been like, I understand like what you're talking about, but like, I don't talk to guides as much. And she was like, I don't really do that as much. I do this. And then she's told me about other people though, that are more, she said like channeler, mediums, etc., that do more of that. And she said, maybe I'll bring in one of them. I'll see if someone like that can come in and contact you. And maybe I can find someone who can do that. And I was like, that would be super cool. I'm sure everyone would love to hear if you have someone who might want to come through from your time frame who talks to guides and see how or if anything has changed. That would be pretty neat. And so she's saying, now back on the subject of what I was talking about. She said, so because things have changed so much, we have really a lot of this technology more integrated. And she said, of course, there are parts of the world that are a little bit slower. And she said, but when we learn about and look through things, we understand them more holistically. Whereas in your time frame, things are more segmented, like they're more siloed. People feel like they're in an island unto themselves. They don't feel like they can put pieces together. They're very fragmented. And she said, we don't really have as much of that. People feel a lot more connected here. And I said, what do you guys do with so much technology integrated? How do you get away? And she said, we just sign off. And she was like looking at me kind of funny. And I was like, but I was like, a lot of us are like, a lot of people are addicted to their phones, or they have to work with technology. They have to work on laptops. They have, computers in school and laptops in schools. And it's been a big thing. Like they're starting to ban Chromebooks in a lot of schools. And a lot of people are going back to, they call them dumb phones, where it's just like flip phones. They don't want social media. They don't want the screen. And she said, that makes a lot of sense. And she said, that's also culturally a really important movement for you. And she said, it's not really studied as much by us, but there is somewhat of a turnaround. And she said, for us, we just have more balance. We don't actually like choose to be online all the time. We don't have as much of that social infrastructure. It exists, but we don't need it as much. And she said, our travel is easier though. And she's showing me, she said, like it's more laborious for you to travel, right? Like it takes a lot of time. And I was like, yes, it can take a lot of time. You're going through airports, you're in security lines. She kind of started laughing when I mentioned security lines. She was just like, do you mean like checkpoints? I said, kind of. And I was like, there's lines we have to go through. We have to check bags. We have to do all these things. And she kind of smirked a little bit. I was like, do you no longer carry luggage? And she goes, oh no, yes, we have luggage, but we have faster transport. Oh yeah, I remember she was talking about this morning. She said, we have these trains. And she's showing things being able to travel at much, much faster speeds. And she said, they're very, very accessible. And she said, of course, there are parts of the world, though, where they use more vintage technology. They call it vintage. But she said, of course, cars still exist. She said, people collect vintage cars still. I said, do they collect any from our time frame? I bet they don't. She goes, not really. And she said, but people do like antique vehicles. And she was showing me like the 1950s, the Buicks and stuff. And I went, oh, okay, that tracks. And she said, yes, those are collector items. They're very valuable in our time frame. And she said, but in your time frame, your transport's a lot slower in general. Your infrastructure is slower in general. And she said, this is really common throughout most countries. she said there will be technological advancements that allow you guys to travel a lot faster and a lot further. And she said it's not going to be as much of a feeling of you needing to be on the phone as much. She's saying, like, people can connect and can talk on these same sort of like screen devices. And she said, but we don't really need to do as much of that anymore. And I was talking to her about apps earlier today, and she was like, apps, like phone apps and things. And I was like, yeah, are those still things? She goes, oh no, we don't need those anymore. I was like, oh, right. I guess that would make sense. Yeah, you guys wouldn't need to have apps because your technology doesn't require apps anymore. And she was like, yeah, everything's more integrated. And she said, but a lot of people choose to go offline. And she said there are huge offline areas where there's no need for technology. People aren't there for technology. They don't want to be disturbed. They don't want to be reachable. And many people go there. She said, really, technology, it's much more integrated and yet more limited. Like, people are just kind of like, they use it when they need to, but they don't need to use it. And I was asking her, in terms of your infrastructure, is it like how Wi-Fi is? And she goes, Wi-Fi? I'm like, oh, okay, I guess not. And she goes, well, we have like built-in infrastructure. And she said, it's much more high tech. She was also saying we've really learned how to work with different frequencies that aren't such a disturbance to the brain and the body. And she said this also has to do with helps people stay healthy. And she winked at me. I was like, eh. And then she said, we also, though, have a lot more technological advancement because we've just had the gift of time. And with that gift of time, there hasn't been as much of this need to stay connected to our devices. She said we have a lot more offline time. And she said we really just enjoy it. We have a lot of balance. And I was like, okay, I don't feel like a lot of people have balance here. And she said, oh no, you are very connected to your devices. It's almost like, she said, it's almost like a drug or something. She's also saying there are certain things that you're being told and shown during your time period that we wanted to tell you. Be really careful about what you take in, because the truth, she said the phrase, and the truth shall set you free. And I said, oh my God, you know that saying? And she goes, oh yes. And she said, the truth shall set you free. And she said, you know how you talk about your gut instinct, your spidey senses, she said, or your intuition? And I said, yes. Because she and I have chatted a little bit, just the two of us. And she said, so that is actually your natural intuitive psychic ability. It's much more common in our day because of the change in frequencies. And she said, but in addition, we want you to kind of pay attention to the fact that your intuition gets clearer. Your psychic senses get clearer, what you know of as truth versus lies. And she's showing like fake information, fake news. She said, you will get more of an instinct around that. If you can, she's saying, if you can kind of like break away. And she's showing people in the woods. And I was like, that's so interesting. My guides say this too. And she said, yes, this makes a lot of sense, because in order for people to have to be really true to themselves, to sense what's right and what's wrong, to sense the truth in what someone else is saying or sharing, there has to be a part of themselves that stays alert and aware, and they have to listen to it. And she said, if you are not paying attention, if you're always on your phones and you're scrolling and you're distracted, you can't really pay as close of attention. She said, not that we are on all the time. And she's kind of like looking up to the upper left, like thinking. And she said, not that we're on all the time, but we're much more aware. And she's showing everyone just being much more connected to their intuition, or it's more like their gut. She's putting her hand over her stomach, like her gut knowing. And she said, yes, we get like a strong sense in the gut. And I said, is that really universal? Like, is that worldwide? And she said, many people have it. There's still some people who aren't as connected. in terms of their body, but she said a lot more people are connected to their body. And she said, we are taught more about being connected to the body, but we also kind of can't help it because there's nothing shielding us from feeling that gut instinct, that gut connection now. And I went, oh, that's so interesting. A lot of people struggle with that here. And she said, oh yes, you have gut problems there. And she was saying, like intestines and stuff. And she said, you have a lot more cancers than we do. And she said, we have our own health ailments, but we have much more preventative measures and we have much better treatment protocols. So things, she said, it's not like we've eradicated all disease. People still pass away from things, but we don't have as many of the things that you might have there. Like there's many things that don't really exist as much anymore here in this time frame. And I told her, people, when Roger came through to talk about some of that stuff, there were so many people who had health questions. And she said, oh, yes, I have no doubt. She said, Roger is not here with her right now, though, so he can't come in to talk. Now, part of what she is saying as well, as she said, there are so many advancements that it's almost hard to completely share it with you. And she said, but when it comes to your own history, one of the things you need to understand is that we studied how passive people were and how much your technology and propaganda was used against you. She said that's very much studied in the future in history classes. And she said we have a lot more, she said you would call it like freedom of press. And she said, you know, you do have freedoms, like you can share information online. You can talk about whatever you want to. But she said there is... So we still have a lot of entertainment here, but we have less distraction. So there's a big difference between entertainment and distraction. We're taught about that in schools now. And she said we have like higher counsel that also really watches over things. And I said, do you still have... So when you say higher counsel, she said, well, they ensure that people are free. And she said, we can't really always, like, they can't go everywhere and take over everything all the time, or like, it's not a dictatorship, she's basically saying. But she said they do have a lot of power and authority. They are able to ensure that a lot of people have true and right information. There's a lot of dedication to that now. And I said, that's really interesting. And she said, we've learned from the past and we don't repeat those mistakes anymore. I thought that's so interesting. Something else she's showing me, I said, so I'm curious about psychic advancement as well. Is it just like everyone's psychic, or is everyone just intuitive? And she said, well, we're more sensory. And she said, so we have more people who can sense things. And she said, it's much more integrated. And she's showing someone being, they're walking through some sort of building and they're placing their hand on a wall. And she said they're called feelers. And she said they're very extraordinary people. They're very highly attuned. And she's showing them being able to place hands on a wall. And they're able to sense things going on, almost like they can say like, oh, this pipe up here is damaged. This thing down here is blah, blah, blah. And she said they're very psychically intuitive, and it's connected to their sense of touch. Like they have to physically be there. So she said they're paid a lot of money, put on site places. They fly out. She's also showing, she said, well, we have advancements in a lot of technology where some of this isn't necessary, but she said there are like a lot of people who are able to do things like that. And she said, but we have a lot more time also to sit and just let our minds wander, to create, to do different things. And she's showing me they still, of course, enjoy going to plays, making things like crafting, painting. And she said, oh, the arts are thriving. We have a lot of arts and artists, musicians, bands, things like that. And I said, so a lot of people are worried about like fake music and AI produced music and things like that. And she said, oh, well, that does exist, but it's not like special. And she was like, she said, we really enjoy instrumentals and raw sounds. And she said, like, no technology, no electricity, no electronics. And I was like, oh, that's really cool. And she said, that's something else we look at about your time period is you had a lot of electronics in your music. And it's not that that's never something we have here, but we have a lot of people who really appreciate the arts. So she's showing people in an orchestra, and she said, like really learning how to play, like this is their craft, this is their profession, this is their joy. And I said, oh yeah, definitely. And she goes, that is really a special thing here. She said arts and sciences are very much evolved. And she said lots of people have art time now because people don't work as much of, like, they don't have that same 40-hour work week. So people have more time for their joys and for hobbies. She said that's very common now, regardless of the part of the world you're in. She said there are some people who work more out of their joy or their passion. But there's more community involvement in everyday tasks as well. She said, for instance, less people litter now. So she's showing like more community involvement in how they take care of the area around them and the world around them. So there's less need for like just to have garbage men or just to have trash pickup or just to have this or that. I was like, oh, that's really great to hear, actually. She said, we also understand health and well-being very differently here. We don't just rest when we can. We rest to prevent needing to rest, if that makes sense. She said, we rest before it gets to us. And she said, that's very cultural. And I said, oh, so is that just where you are? And she goes, no, it's very common in many parts of the world now. She said, of course, some people still work more, but they pay more attention. She said, when people are overworking, work, and it's like workaholics. I asked her and she said, what's that? I was like, when people work, they're obsessed with work. They just want to work all the time. She said, oh yes, we consider that part of like a mental imbalance now. I was like, this is wild because my guides have talked about this. I don't really talk about it much, but they have mentioned it. And she said, yeah, it's thought to be chemical imbalance and stress related. And she said, and it's addressed more like locally. And she's showing me, it's considered to be an imbalance. And she's showing people going into these scanners, but these scanners don't just scan the brain and body for something that might be going on or something that might be out of balance. It's almost like this light and vibration and sound technology that repairs things at the same time as it's scanning. And the person's just standing in there. They look almost like they're being held, almost like they're not floating, but they feel very light. I'm like, how could they stand in there for that long and keep their arms up? And she said, oh, they are almost like suspended. I said, that's pretty high tech. Is that everywhere? And she said, well, it's more common in some countries than others. She said, but people are allowed to choose what they want to use. If they want to go to traditional healers and medicine people, those are very much respected now. And she's saying like healing arts and energetic workers and things are much more widespread and understood to be magnificent beings. And she said, we don't fear them and we don't have a prejudice against them now. There's no, like, we're not trying to shut them out from the healing arts. Sometimes they come in. She's showing them working with surgeons, with doctors as well. She said many people in the healthcare industry in our day and time actually go to medicine people, to energy workers or she said heart workers, people, and she's showing someone placing their hand on someone's chest. She said because so many people who work in she said, say like surgery, they need healing arts as well. And she said, now that's not everywhere in the world, but many places now have things like that. It's much more integrated, she said. Now this is fascinating too, because she said we have more regenerative power too. And I was like, okay, so like, what's an example? And she was showing me someone's finger. Someone lost a finger, like an accident. And there's a regenerative technology to help their finger. And she's showing me the teeth. This is fascinating. I was like, this can't be. It's just so hard to imagine that being widespread. I'm like, wait, how? She said, yes, well, some people for certain technologies, they have to travel to get them. Like they might be in a more rural area or different area and they need to go travel to get that thing done, but it is possible. She said some people they don't choose certain treatments. Like they don't want to do that. She said that's allowed. Like people have choice. And I said, oh, well, that's good to know because people are worried about that. And she said, well, it's understandable in your time frame. And she was kind of looking at me like, no, really. Like she was not laughing about it. She's saying, can we pause here? And she's putting her hand on her temple. And I said, okay. And I notice sometimes my brain gets it's almost like I feel like a little more spacey, lightheaded. And this morning when she was talking to me, she said, if I do this too long, I get a little lightheaded, I get a headache. And I went, oh, so I'm picking up on you when that's happening. I thought it was it's kind of like an and both. And even this morning, she came in while I was walking, like I mentioned, and I felt like a twinge, like a pop of pain in my temple. And I went, ooh. And she goes, yeah, that's me. I get headaches sometimes when I do this. And I was like, oh, okay, my apologies. And it was like right in the right temple. And I'm like, I used to get migraines there. That's so wild. So, yeah. Anyhow, I'm going to let her kind of take a little bit of space and take a little bit of time off. And we'll come in and see if she has more to say soon. If you have questions for her, feel free to submit them on the website. I have everything linked up in the show notes if you want to submit more questions for Anna. And as she mentioned, she's going to try to get someone to come in who has more knowledge of history where they don't have to look a lot more things up. And if there's other subject areas you're curious about, she's trying to find people who would be able to pop in and work with us as well. So where she could maybe make an introduction or something. So if you're curious, just let us know. And thank you guys so much for listening to this episode of the podcast this week. I truly hope you guys will come back and listen some more. And I will continue to do a little bit more on the gene keys and the human design and all of the transits and the energy transits and stuff. I know that initially those can be a little bit complicated to look at, but they're really cool when you kind of look at how they weave in with like astrology and different things going on. So, I will do some separate episodes on those and hopefully everyone really keeps enjoying those.